We're looking at session number 61 in our series in Mark, looking at chapter 11, 27 through 33, the end of chapter 11. We'll finish up 11 today, start 12 next session. Title, Challenge and Counter Challenge. Most of you are probably familiar with this episode. Now, again, we're going to finish Mark 11. We're going to follow Jesus and the 12 as they re-enter Jerusalem, following the sight of the barren fig tree and the teaching that Jesus did about prayer, faith, and forgiveness. So after that particular faith, there's going to be another section involving this time, as our title suggests, a challenge by the leaders of the Sanhedrin, along with Jesus' counter challenge. What is it that's going to be challenged? Jesus' source of authority, or also the general source of authority when it comes to God's business. It's now Tuesday of the week leading up to Passover and Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus, I think, is like 3 days away, something like that. So Jesus and the 12 are walking in the temple, probably in the halls of the court of the Gentiles, where he had caused an uproar as he cleaned his temple yesterday, Monday. And we'll see Jesus generally in the temple during his Passion Week. This is where you would typically find him whenever he was ministering in Jerusalem. You want to minister to the most people, go to the temple, the center of worship. Who did the 12 and Jesus encounter? Those most likely found serving in the temple, priests, scribes, and even elders, who were, by the way, the general makeup of the leadership of the Sanhedrin. So, let's begin in chapter 11, verse 27 of Mark. And they, the 12, and Jesus, came again to Jerusalem, and as he, Jesus, was walking in the temple with the 12, we suspect, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him. Again, the chief priests very likely included the high priest Caiaphas, who had prophesied Jesus' death on behalf on the part of Israel. Remember, he said it would be profitable for one man to die for or to save the nation Israel. He didn't know what he was saying, of course, but he was prophesying. He was the chief among the high priests. As usual, this group of leaders had a question. That's typically how people approach Jesus, so we're likely testing him. That was to actually bring him a question. This time, the question really is within their job description. It wasn't a fakey question, even though they may have bad motives. It was within their job description, as I just mentioned. And it goes something like this. Jesus, what gives you the right to judge and disturb the activities of the temple. The responsibility for the temple activity was, of course, Caiaphas by law, by Moses' direction. Moses gave the responsibility for the well-being of the temple and its worship services was given to Aaron and his posterity. Remember, the priestly order in Israel all came from Aaron. This group was of the highest possible level in Judaism and in Israel. They were a combination of religious and legal authorities. Verse 28, and they began saying to him, this to Jesus, so this is this group of leaders from the Sanhedrin, we assume, were saying something to Jesus, and here's what it is in verse 28. By what authority are you doing these things? And we assume that that refers principally to his having cleansed the temple the day before. And then they conclude the question, or who gave you this authority to do these things? Again, the question is technically within their bailiwick. It was a proper question, and it was proper for them to ask Jesus this question. By the way, this is the second time they had asked that question, or at least an equivalent question. And the first occasion occurred with the first temple cleansing. I'm going to read from John 2, verses 18 and 19. And this is after the first cleansing of the temple that Jesus performed at the beginning of his public ministry. The Jews therefore answered and said to him, what sign do you show to us, seeing that you do these things? In other words, they said, we want you to show us something that will prove that you have a right to do this. Jesus answered and said to them, and catch this, this must have really stumped them. Jesus answered and said to them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. And of course, you remember the argument went, wait a minute, Herod took over 40 years, you're going to tear it down and build it back up in 3 days? Of course, he was not talking about the physical temple. He knew that would be destroyed in AD 70. He was talking about his own body. In that case, they demanded a miracle or some action that would prove his right to cleanse the temple. And so he gave it to them. He actually said there isn't going to be a sign other than, and I think at one point he said, the sign of Jonah, which was the 3 days he just talked about. Perhaps they were looking for something that would identify Jesus as a prophet. Something indicated he was sent by God on a mission. Of course, if they'd been listening over the last 3 years, they would have heard him repeatedly say that he was on the Father's mission. And the Father, his Father, was God. So, let's look at John 5, verses 18-9. For this cause, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. So this was early on. It wasn't very deep in maybe during the first year of his ministry. There was also already a plot to kill him, or at least looking for a way to bring it about. And if you remember in the early part of Mark, there was another contingency, a set of Pharisees cooperating with Herodians, those who backed Herod and Roman rule. That group was coming together in order to find a way to kill Jesus too. So this is something that's been going on. They were seeking the more to kill him. Why? Because he not only was breaking the Sabbath, their version of it, of course, but was also calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Remember, in that culture, the Son was considered to be of the same substance and nature as the Father. So if God, Yahweh, is Jesus' Father, then Jesus has the same substance and nature as Yahweh. And of course, he was Yahweh. Well, let's move on to verse 19. That's in Mark 11, of course. Jesus therefore answered and was saying to them, I'm sorry, this is not Mark. I'm still in John. I've read verse 18, now going to read verse 19, if I can get it done, that is. Jesus therefore answered their request, I'm assuming, and was saying to them, the leaders, truly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself. He says the Son's incapable of doing anything by himself unless it is something he sees the Father doing. So as Son, he can do what the Father can do. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in like manner. And that's a straightforward cultural expectation and argument. Why in this case? They wanted to charge him with blasphemy. Why? Because blasphemy carried the death penalty. It was dangerous to blaspheme God because you could be stoned. But as he, Jesus, and the same as with most rabbis often did, he answered this time, back to Mark 11, he answered the question of the Sanhedrin leaders with a question of his own, posing an impossible dilemma for those guys. Look at verses 29 and 30. And Jesus said to them, the leaders of the Sanhedrin, I will ask you one question, and you answer me, and then I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Jesus said, I'm going to ask you a question. You answer it. If and when you answer it, I will answer your question. Was the baptism, this is verse 30, was the baptism of John, in other words, was what John did as a ministry, was that from heaven, meaning God? From heaven was a way of saying God without saying Yahweh, which they never spoke. So, was the baptism of John from heaven, from God, or from men? It was his own doings. Answer me. From heaven, again, was the way of avoiding saying Yahweh. The Old Testament Amos had a similar kind of problem. But it wasn't exactly the same. But I want to show you what this old dude from Judah did. He he acted in an interesting way when challenged by a high muckety-muck from the northern kingdom. I think he was the head priest at Bethel, where was one of the golden calf things was set up, so those in the north would not have to go to the southern kingdom in order to worship. They would have their own place of worship. So the king thought. So I'm going to read Amos 7, verses 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. A bit of a stretch, maybe. Then Amaziah, who was the priest of Bethel, said to Amos, "Go, you seer, flee away to the land of Judah." In other words, go back home, guy, and there eat bread and do your prophesying. Do your thing there, not here. But no longer prophesy at Bethel, for it is a sanctuary of the king, and the king is the one who had set up the temple in Bethel, and it's a royal residence. And then Amos gets to respond. Listen to his response. And this is a guy who could probably get him bumped off. For it, go back. Then Amos answered. I'm in verse 14 if you're trying to find where it is. 14 of Amos 7. Then Amos answered and said to Amaziah, "I'm not a prophet, nor am I the son of a prophet, for I am a herdsman and a grower of sycamore figs." He raised trees, cared for trees, sycamore, like Zacchaeus grabbed a hold of and climbed. Verse 15, "But the Lord took me from following the flock, and so Yahweh took me from the flock, and Yahweh said to me, go prophesy to my people Israel." That's the northern kingdom. "And now hear the word of Yahweh." Moses said, now I'm going to tell you what Yahweh says. "You are saying, you shall not prophesy against Israel, nor shall you speak against the house of Isaac." That's very strange that you see the house of Isaac. But it was. And then in verse 17, Amos gets to what Yahweh said. "Therefore, thus says Yahweh, your wife will become a harlot in the city." How'd you like to start with a high muckety-muck with that statement? Your wife's going to become a whore. "Your sons and your daughters will fall by the sword." Your sons and daughters are going to be executed. They're going to be killed. "Your land will be parceled up by a measuring line." Somebody else is going to take a look at your land, measure it up, "and you yourself will die upon unclean soil." Where would unclean soil be? Outside Israel. In this particular case, it would be Assyria. So look what he says. Your wife will become a harlot, your sons and daughters will be killed, your land will be parceled out to others, and you will die in Assyria. Moreover, Israel will certainly go from its land into exile. So not only is Amaziah, wasn't that the guy's name? Yeah, Amaziah. Not only is Amaziah going to die in Assyria, the whole country is going to be sent out of Israel into Assyria for the most part. So here's an old guy who was a prophet, but he said, I'm not a prophet, really. I mean, he meant that he wasn't typically a prophet. He wasn't taught as a prophet. He wasn't schooled as a prophet. He wasn't a son of a prophet. He was there doing his business as a businessman, farmer, rancher, that sort of thing. God came along and said, I got a job for you. He went, and that's what happened. And his final exit was that he told the high priest, if you please, of Bethel, these are the 4 or 5 things that are going to happen to you. By the way, Jesus, when he said, answer me, that was a command, with the implication that their refusal to answer would negate his obligation to answer their other question. Mark is the only one who adds this answer me command for some reason. Jesus' question actually implies what his answer would have been had he answered. His authority was from the same God from whom John the Baptist, J.B., received his authority. So if you tell me truly from whom J.B. got his authority, you will have the answer to your own question. The key to Jesus' question then was that he required they attest to J.B.'s source of authority, which was the same as his, a mission directly from Yahweh. So, what Jesus was asking, was God behind J.B.'s work? Now, that places these guys in a hard place. Look at how they go over in the corner, apparently, somewhere, start mumbling to each other. And they began reasoning among themselves. That means they were over there mumbling over what Jesus had just said. And they come up with this conclusion. If we say John's or J.B.'s authority came from heaven, meaning from God, then he's going to say, then why did you not believe him? Because they didn't, remember? They never bought into what J.B. was saying. Verse 32, but shall we say from men? That's the only other choice Jesus gave them. Why did they answer that? For they were afraid of the multitude, for all in the multitude considered J.B. to have been a prophet indeed. So they say, if we say from heaven, he's got an answer back. Why? And they didn't even think about him answering their question. They said, he's just going to say, why didn't you believe him? If we say it comes from men, not God, then the crowd's going to jump us because they believe they came from God. So if they answered from God, they knew J.B. himself had proclaimed the same for Jesus. J.B. himself claimed Jesus was sent of God. John 1:15. John bore, and that's J.B., bore witness of him and cried out, saying, this is he of whom I said, he who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. That's interesting if you think back. John the Baptist was born before Jesus, but of course Jesus existed long before his incarnation. Now jump down to verses 29 and 30 of chapter chapter 1 of John. The next day he, J.B., saw Jesus coming to him and said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." How much more of a God-ordained task would you have? Verse 30, "This is he on behalf of whom I said, after me comes a man who has a higher rank than I, because he existed before me." That made them afraid of Jesus and his true mission. But they dare not deny what all the people knew of J.B. the prophet. And they declared that, that J.B. declared that Jesus' mission was the same as his own. It was a mission sent by God. So they were but they were concerned, the high muckety mucks, they were concerned over what the people might do here in the temple. And they didn't know. Would they cleanse the temple again and do the same thing Jesus had done or not? We don't know. We can't. So they had no guts. They took out a face-saving, so they thought, path. But their response damaged their position, for they effectively declared themselves unable and unqualified to judge Jesus' actions. It's from Mark 11:33a. And answering Jesus, they said, "We don't know." So what did they just do? Well, they took the easy way out, so they thought. But they also were saying, we're not qualified to judge Jesus' actions, or anything for that matter, because this was a simple question that they could not answer. And yes, Jesus was qualified to judge and conduct and control conduct in his temple. It was, after all, God's temple. Jesus is God, so it was Jesus' temple too. His cleansing was not a high-handed act of a protester, but the reasonable reaction of the owner to that which was violated. Jesus' actions were reasonable, in keeping with who he was and the nature of that which he disturbed. But they had only one face-saving way out. They admitted ignorance. It didn't work. And Jesus closed the debate with 11:33b, the last half of the verse. They said, "I don't know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Well, it's interesting. In the next session, we're going to look at a parable that Jesus used to build on this event. He told this parable while these elders and scribes and Pharisees, priests, high priests, all of those who were leaders in the Sanhedrin were still there when Jesus tells this next parable. And you know what is interesting? Normally, Jesus used parables to keep some information from his opposition, those who would stop him, opposed him, not agree with him. But in this case, he's going to look the opposition in the eye and tell them a parable they will understand fully. They won't like it, but they're going to understand. So we're going to move from chapter 11 into chapter 12 and look at that parable and then we'll get on with some of the other things coming.